Hello, my friends. My name is Adam, and I'm on a quest to be the most prolific reviewer of all time. And to do that, I need to review about 15,000 items of culture because 15,000 is the record for the most reviews published on Goodreads, I think, which is amazing. But anyway, to do that, I mostly review movies and television because I spend a lot of time watching TV, but also I really love podcasts. So I have done one review of a podcast so far, The History of the 20th Century, and I really recommend that one. This podcast that I'm going to review, I'm not going to recommend. You can check it out if you'd like and come to your own opinion. And I don't mean to be disrespectful of somebody who makes a podcast because I think that it's different when somebody makes a movie or makes television because there are hundreds of voices in the decision that get made. And so when you criticize the writing of the movie or the acting, you're not just criticizing like that one person. You're criticizing like the whole production. And with podcasts, when you criticize something, you're actually criticizing that person. So I want to say that he does a great job with the narration, and he does a great job with the storytelling. Not the storytelling, with the research. The storytelling is the problem, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. But what is the topic of 20th century revolutions? Well, first, I think the title is confusing because the first two seasons are deal with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And if you don't know what the Ottoman Empire was, the Ottoman Empire was sort of a multi-ethnic empire that was led by the Turks, the Ottomans, and they controlled Turkey, not only Turkey, but like large swaths of the Middle East, like Iraq, Arabia, Syria, Palestine, into Algeria, Tunis, and into the Balkans as well. And the rise of the Ottomans was something that was so influential on the development of Europe. There was this fear that they were going to conquer Europe, and then there was a battle in Vienna with Jan Sobieski, the third of Poland, where he defeated the forces, with help, of course, defeated the forces of the invading Turks and then stopped them from expanding further into Europe. And that battle is considered one of the most profound and important in the history of Europe. Well, flash forward about 500 years, and the Ottomans have been in the Balkans for that time, and 500 years is a super long time. Like, if you think about the Roman Empire in the West, of course, in the East, it lasted maybe about, I don't know, almost 2,000 years, but in the West, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not by much. But in the West, it lasted about 800 years. So 500 years is a really long time when it comes to people's lives. So people, Turkish people, Muslim people, grew up under the Ottoman system in the Balkans, in the Middle East, all those places that I mentioned. And the the cracks in the facade of Ottoman imperial power started to appear when Christian nations started to interfere to make other Christian nations independent. And the first one was Greece in the 1820s. And that set the stage for other rebellions like Serbia, Bulgaria, and you could make the argument that actually this collapse is one of the primary things that motivated the outbreak of the First World War. Because, and he does make this point in the show, but I'll talk about my criticism in a moment. So basically, there was this thing called irredentism. And irredentism sounds like a weird term that nobody should know, but actually, it's really important to understand the development of nation states in the 18th century. Because what happened was, so the Greeks rebelled against Ottomans and they became independent. And the Greeks were like, hey, we used to control all of these little islands and stuff, and there's still Greek people there. So Greece should be like this huge country with, half of Asia Minor and Greece itself. And then when Serbia became independent, they were like, we should control all of this, like Kosovo, because we controlled Kosovo, we controlled Bosnia in the Middle Ages. And never mind that the demographics had changed since the Middle Ages because of the 500 years of Ottoman impact in the area, let's say, control of the area. So Bosnia wasn't a Serbian majority country anymore. And the idea of what a Serbian is also kind of strange because you have these ethnic groups in the Balkans who are very related, like the Serbs, the Croats, and the Bosniaks. And those three groups share the same language, but they're only divided by religion. So the Croats are Catholic, the Serbians are Orthodox, and the Bosniaks are Muslim. And so in the 90s, I remember that there was this whole kind of narrative that was going on, and sometimes you still hear it about like, oh, the Balkans are this bloodthirsty place and there'll never be any peace between the Balkans. But really, the conflict that happened after the collapse of Yugoslavia had a lot to do with this irredentism that I mentioned before. So Bulgaria also becomes independent, and Bulgaria, they want to not only resurrect the Bulgarian state from the Middle Ages, but they want to resurrect the Byzantine Empire. They want to attack Constantinople and, free it of the Muslim influence and then have a new Byzantine Empire and a new Rome, which is funny because everybody is always trying to get to a new Rome. Like the Ottomans thought that they were a new Rome, and the Russians thought that they were the third Rome. They like to call themselves. So, but anyway, back to my point, and so this irredentism also kind of sparked the Zionist movement. So, which Palestine was also a part of the Ottoman Empire at the time. So Zionism started in the late 18th century, 19th century. They were like, we're going to go back to Palestine because that's where our roots are. Never mind that happened 2,000 years ago, and they were expelled from that land. And it's kind of like these Americans thinking that they're Irish or Italian when they've been living in America for like 5 generations. Maybe culturally you have like an Italian American culture, but you're not Italian anymore from Italy. You're like a different form of Italian or Irish or whatever. So that's the same with the Jewish diaspora. So anyway, what happened before the First World War is that these powers, because of the growing independence of Christian states in the Balkans, like the Russians wanted to have Constantinople because they wanted, the Third Rome thing, but also they wanted their Black Sea fleet to be able to go into the Mediterranean because of the fact that their other 2 fleets got wiped out in the Russo-Japanese War, and that war was spurned by the collapse of the Ming Empire. And so the French and the English took control of Egypt, the French took control of Algeria, and the Russians kind of tried to take control of Bulgaria, but they weren't as effective. And so these were like places that were nominally under control of the Ottomans, but they were actually under control of other powers. So this collapsing empire kind of was like a black void that sucked the major power systems of Europe into conflict, because the Austrians, they took control of Bosnia. And remember what I said before about the Bosnians the Serbians thinking that Bosnia was part of Serbia because it had been part of Serbia from the Middle East, from the Middle Ages. So anyway, the Bosnians, the Austrians ended up, so they were nominally in control of Bosnia, like the French were nominally in control of Algeria and Tunis, and the um, the English were nominally in control of Egypt. So, but what happened before? So the Austrians annexed Bosnia, and then that caused some conflict with Serbia, and they were constantly for like a period of about 10 years on the brink of war over that. And then during the time, there was like a Balkan War where those Balkan powers that I mentioned, like Greece, Bulgaria, and Serbia, were fighting against the Ottomans because their power was collapsing in the Balkans, and they wanted to get like a bigger and bigger piece of the pie. And so they beat the Ottomans, I think in like 1912 or something, and then immediately they started fighting with each other. So there had been like 5 years of wars in the Balkans before the outbreak of the First World War. So the Russians had an interest in the Balkans, the Austrians had an interest in the Balkans, the French and the English had an interest in the Middle East. And so that that collapsing empire had a huge effect on the outbreak of the First World War, because if you don't know, what happened after that was the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand went to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, because it had been recently annexed, and he was like, yay, you're part of Austria now. And there's another part to this story as well, that the Italians had become independent from Austria. So Austria was always a multi-ethnic empire, and they had lost the Italians. So they were really afraid of losing the Slavs. So for the Austrians, this was like an existential threat, this Serbian irredentism, because the Serbians claimed that, remember I said the Croats and the Serbians and the Bosniaks are all kind of one people divided by religion? Well, at the time they believed that too, which led to the Kingdom of Yugoslavia and the Republic of Yugoslavia later. So yeah, Franz Ferdinand gets shot, and then the Austrians give Serbia, so basically he gets shot by Serbian terrorists, and the Austrians say, hey, you have to do this, 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 or we declare war. And the things that the Austrians demanded were really, really brutal, and no independent country could accept all of those terms. So the Serbians refused, Austrian declared war, and then so Austria declared war against Serbia, and Serbia had this relationship with Russia. So Russia declared war on Serbia, and then Austria, and because Germany and Austria had this alliance, Germany declared war on Russia, but also on France, because France had that alliance with Russia. And then the Germans, for their own tactical reasons, because they had been having this conflict with France over control of Central Europe for 50 years or something like that, they invaded through Belgium, and Belgium was being protected, had like a neutrality guarantee from the UK, and the UK was like, oh, nope, you can't invade through Belgium, we're going to be in this war too. So you can see that all of this, this Balkans situation happened because of the collapse of the Ottomans. If the Ottomans had been a strong, stable power in the Balkans, the First World War wouldn't have happened. The Depression wouldn't have happened. The Second World War wouldn't have happened. The Cold War wouldn't have happened. And the world that we live in today wouldn't exist. So it's like such an important story. And so I've been talking for like 14 minutes about this story without actually mentioning the podcast. So why is the podcast that has such an interesting story that I'm telling you in like the really condensed version, why is it not good? Well, as I said, it's really well researched, and the host does a good job of presenting it, but it's not well written. What I mean by that is that you don't have to take like the outline of what I said to make your podcast. You could do it in a different way, but good nonfiction podcasts, they have a narrative, right? They follow the rules of storytelling, even though they're nonfiction, because humans like those rules. Like, we find them enjoyable. We like knowing, okay, we're in the middle, this is the beginning, these are the things that happened in the beginning, and these are the things that happened in the middle, and this is why that thing happened, and okay, now we're here. But so the podcast called the 20th Century Revolutions, like, what revolution are we talking about? Like the Young Turk Revolution? Like, first of all, it doesn't seem like a real revolution. It seems like the podcast is about the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and everything that went along with that, which, as I mentioned previously, is really important in the history of the world right now. One of the major things that happened that led us to where we are. But there's no, so he will talk about like Albanians in one episode, in Georgians in another, Armenians in another. He'll spend like on Palestine a while, and there's no overarching thing, right? Like, it will just be like, oh, next episode we're going to talk about the Sublime Porte. And then the next episode we're talking about Armenia. And those things are important, right? But it's not like the things that he's mentioning in the podcast aren't important for the whole story. They are, but the way that they're organized doesn't really do a good job satisfying that quest we have for narrative, maybe not completion, but the enjoyment of a narrative. And I think a lot of history podcasts, so if I may back up a little bit, people think that podcasting became super popular with Serial, the true crime podcast. And Serial did get true crime podcast to be super, super popular. But in the genre of history podcasts, there's one person who, and I'll do a review of him in a bit, who did the like foundational work of talking about history in a podcast format, and that's Mike Duncan. And Mike Duncan, I'm mentioning him by name, and I'm not mentioning the creator of 20th Century Revolutions by name, just because I am being critical, so I don't want to like say, because I understand it's hard work to do a podcast, and I'm just not satisfied with his podcast. But Mike Duncan, he is the one who inspired a lot of people to create history podcasts. So much so that when I had briefly my own podcast called The History of Hockey, or the Hockey History Podcast. There was two at the same time. We were fighting. But anyway, mine was called The History of Hockey Podcast. And the Hockey History Podcast guy, he was like, you should be more like Mike Duncan. He was pretty critical of me. But I was like, I never watched or listened to Mike Duncan before then. But now I can see that he had a point. Because Mike Duncan, he started with a podcast called The History of Rome. It's really the history of Western Rome, from the beginning until the collapse of Western Rome, because, as we know, Rome continued until the Ottomans, who I mentioned before, sacked Constantinople and renamed it Istanbul. So, and then he did a podcast called The Revoultions Podcast. And Mike Duncan he is one of the, like, he is kind of this godfather of history podcasting, because he has been able to kind of create the format, have a narrative that makes sense when you're talking about like these broad historical events, and make it feel like, even though there are like 40 episodes about one topic, that there's a beginning, a middle, an end. The story has narrative structure. The things that he's talking about are not only interesting but entertaining, and that's really, really hard to do. And so I think if you wanted to see why the history of the 20th century is not successful, listen to one episode of any Mike Duncan podcast, and then listen to this podcast. And that doesn't mean that every history podcast needs to be like Mike Duncan's take on history podcast. There's different ways to do it. Like Hardcore History has a completely different take on how to do a history podcast. It's like a novel read dramatically in a dramatic fashion. And then another podcast that I like is The Fall of Civilizations, where you still have that narrative structure, but the creator of that podcast is really good at the atmosphere. You know, you hear the language of the people as they spoke it. You get these like in-depth stories about things that people in the West don't really know about, like what really happened during the fall of the Aztec Empire, or what really happened during the Mongol rapid expansion. So I think when I love history podcasts, but when I listen to them, what I want is information, sure, but also that narrative structure. So I think that the 20th century revolutions doesn't really do it for me. And I think maybe if it was I know it would be a lot of work, but if it was rebranded and refocused on the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, like I'm sure there's like a podcast about the Ottoman Empire, but that would be much, much better. Because as I said, it's one of the most important things to have happened in history in the last 200 years, because the consequences of that collapse led to the modern world, you know. But maybe you disagree with me about my review. If you do, leave it in the comments, and maybe I'll argue with you, maybe I'm not, maybe I won't. I'm trying not to argue with Russian bots on my commentary videos, but it's hard. It's hard. It's hard. You know, but I think if you put a comment on this episode, on this video, then I know it's not a bot, because we're not talking about anything too controversial here. If you like what I do, please subscribe to the channel. I'm trying to get to 900 subscribers by the end of April, because I reached my goal of 800 subscribers. So thank you very much. And if you like, subscribe and comment. Thank you. Bye-bye.